Hi guys. Today, I'm going to recap a 2012 Korean action thriller movie called Confession of Murder. Before we start, warning. Spoilers ahead. This is Detective Choi. 15 years ago, he was chasing a serial killer who murdered 10 women. While chasing him, he shot the killer in the shoulder. However, he still failed to catch him. Not only that, the killer also managed to stab Detective Choi and slit his mouth. Just like Joker, but only the left side of his mouth. And today, the 15-year statute of limitations expires, so the killer can no longer be prosecuted. Detective Choi can't do anything and can only get drunk. And also, one of the victim's son called Detective Choi in depression, knowing that the statute of limitations expires today. He then decided to jump off the rooftop, ending his life. 2 years have passed. When Detective Choi watches television, he is shocked by the news that the serial killer he's been looking for appears to confess everything he did. His name is Lee. He claims the 10 murders 17 years ago and launches a book, I Am the Murderer, containing detailed description of the victims and murders. To prove that, he also shows his wound in his shoulder where Detective Choi shot him with the bullet that's still lodged there. Because of his attractive face and his sincere public apology, he gained many supporters and is growing in popularity. He even apologizes in front of the victim's family house, begging for forgiveness. And not to forget, he also visits Detective Choi, whom he previously kept alive with a scar on the face. Detective Choi then spat on him and threw food at him. On the other hand, Mrs. Han, the mother of the 11th victim, who is still missing, is gathering some family members of the victims to plot revenge on Lee. After plotting the kidnapping plan, they finally sneak in while Lee is swimming, and release snakes into the pool. Lee is bitten by the snake, and then rushed to an ambulance. But it turns out that was the plan of the victims' families disguised as ambulance crews. Realizing that, Lee's bodyguards chase after them, along with Detective Choi, who happened to be passing by and saw them. But in the end, they failed and now Lee is held captive by the victims' families. When Mrs. Han is interrogating him where her daughter is and whether he has killed her, suddenly the lights go out. A mysterious man frees Lee and takes him away from there. He then leaves Lee in a room with a note. Don't make a fuss about this incident if you value your life. In front of the media, Lee doesn't dare say anything about his abductor. He says that he was kidnapped by his fans and will not press any charges. And now, Lee and Detective Choi are invited to a television show where they will have an open debate. Some experts are also present to discuss the case. Their debate is quite heated. Until finally comes the question session. A mysterious caller, called Jay, asks Lee a nonsense question. How fast Detective Choi runs the 100 meters, he asked. And after a few questions, he finally threatens Lee not to put on a show, hinting that he is the real serial killer. All were surprised. The families of the victims, the media, and also Detective Choi, who immediately tracks and chases Jay, the caller. But it turns out that the location of the caller is Detective Choi's mother's house. Detective Choi rushes there and finds a note that the killer will slit his mother's throat if he pisses the killer off. He shouts angrily, which makes his mother wake up and she turns out to be fine. From across the building, someone is taunting him. It's Jay. He goes there right away, but left only a tape recorder and a murder knife. In that recording, the 11th victim, Soo-yeon, is being held captive and crying in fear. It turns out that Soo-yeon is Detective Choi's fiancée. They were about to get married before she went missing, being kidnapped by the serial killer, until now. On the other hand, Lee holds a press conference. He says that he lost the knife he used to murder because his safe was broken into. He insists on claiming that he is the real serial killer. Meanwhile, Detective Jay gets a call from Jay. Jay asks why Detective Choi lets Lee, the con man, run wild like that. He also mentions Detective Choi's fiancée, which makes him very angry. Until one day, when Lee is holding a press conference, he gets a call from Jay, who has also called the media. He challenges Lee to a three-way open chat on television with Detective Choi. Without thinking, Lee agrees. And on the other hand, Mrs. Han is preparing a pen with snake venom for her to bring. She will come to the debate and kill the real serial killer after the facts are revealed. Until the day of the debate arrives. And as promised, Jay comes to the studio elegantly, He doesn't even mind showing his real face. There, to prove that he is the real serial killer, he has prepared evidence. He has told the reporter the place where he buried his last victim, Soo-yeon. And it's true, after the location is excavated, a woman's skull is found. The moderator then continues to question Lee whether he still admitted that he is the real killer. Lee finally confesses that he is not the real killer. Lee's mother is the first victim of Jae. And the book was not his writing, but the real author is Detective Choi. They planned this 2 years ago, when Lee was trying to kill himself due to depression. But he didn't die and his face was crushed. Then Detective Choi planned all of this. Jae is amused by the cleverness of Detective Choi's plan. But he says there is nothing Detective Choi can do now, because the statute of limitations has long expired. Detective Choi then plays the recording tape, where a shocking fact is revealed. A radio in the background broadcasted the 14th presidential election ballot count, which means that the footage was shot almost to that exact date 15 years ago, and there is still 14 minutes before the statute of limitations expires. Jae then reveals that he kept Soo-yeon for 2 years before he murdered her. Jae imitates what Soo-yeon said before he killed her, which enrages Detective Choi so much that he almost shoots Jae. But the other police stopped him. During the chaos, Jae managed to escape and take Mrs. Han hostage. Jae runs away, being chased by Detective Choi and the victims' families. And just like a typical action movie, another intense chase scene lasts quite a while. Like this. Until finally, Detective Choi managed to take Jae down and almost strangled him to death, before being stopped by the other police. Lee is also there and trying to stab him, but the police stop him. Mrs. Han appears and is about to stab Jae with the venomous pen she prepared. But she is stopped by Detective Choi, who wants to kill Jae the most. She's crying hysterically, but Detective Choi is also devastated because Mrs. Han's daughter is also his fiancée. Jae could only laugh evilly. But it turns out that Choi already stabbed him with the pen he took from Mrs. Han. Now, Jae is really being killed by Detective Choi. At the end of the story, Choi is released from jail. He is welcomed by all the victims' families and media. And because of him too, the statute of limitations is extended to 25 years. Thanks for watching.